Kia ora, I'm Paul Sinclair, co-founder of Only From NZ, and welcome to Kiwi Fleas. Each episode I catch up with one of the million Kiwis who've exported themselves out of Aotearoa, New Zealand, because I'm curious about them. Who are they? Where are they? What are they up to? And how are they helping shape the world's opinion of us, one unique international New Zealander story at a time? Today's Kiwi Flea left New Zealand in 2017. She's an Olympian and Commonwealth Games medalist who has lived and breathed sports and then sports administration for most of her life. In 2022, she became a recipient of the Kia World Class New Zealander Award. 2 years later, she was made a companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to sports governance and women. And her leadership roles since leaving New Zealand include her appointment as the General Manager of Women's Rugby at World Rugby, and the second, her current role, is as CEO of the Commonwealth Games Federation. Both place her squarely on the global podium of sports leadership. Katie Sadleir, welcome to Kiwi Fleas.
Good morning, Paul. Or good evening, Paul, I should say.
I'm going to start with a kick-off warm-up question, which I ask all my guests on this pod, and that is, I'd like you to cast your mind back to a time when you were living in New Zealand and remember the biggest laugh of your life. Where were you? Who were you with? And what were you up to?
Okay. You know, it's interesting. I did listen to your first podcast, and congratulations. It was fantastic listening to Ellie's story. And I've reviewed her Meet Patty story a couple of times since then. It was quite a laugh. A funny time for me. You know, I think I'll go back to something which I still think is hilarious, because I had Sharon Van Gulik over here for dinner last week, and I was talking to Karen Smith, other people who were very much part of my sport career in New Zealand and still are, and we were talking about funny times, and they reminded me of a conference that I was involved in Wellington for the New Zealand Recreation Association, and Sharon and Karen and I decided that we would be the social committee for that conference, which pulled together a lot of people that you know, and it was a really good time. And we had this Halloween party up at the top of the Botanical Gardens, and we had taken the cable car up to it, and we were staying downtown and we were kind of going through a phase back then with people like Steve Chu and a few of us, where when you got into that kind of party mood, you just did stupid things, didn't you? And we seemed to be on an eating flowers stage of our life. And what that meant was just every now and then, and this was before, of course, flowers became the most popular thing to put edible flowers in salads. We just did that. It was a trend setting. And we were coming back from Botanical Gardens late at night, and we got off at the gardens, and the two ladies that I mentioned before decided to go grazing amongst the flowers in the Botanical Gardens. We ended up, I just thought it was hilarious. I was just taking pictures, and we got back down to the hotel, and then all of a sudden, they started to have their throats contracting. And it was like about 3:00 in the morning, where I had to phone the poison center in Dunedin to say, look, I don't really know what to do with my friends here. And they said, well, what have they been doing? I said, well, they've been eating flowers out of the Botanical Gardens. And they said, they've what? And I said, yes. And I said, so they sort of said, what type of flowers? And I sort of mentioned, well, I didn't really know what, it was late at night. So they sort of said I had to force them to drink, call the concierge and force them to drink 4 liters of milk before they go to bed. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in a good situation. Anyways, that was all the drama. That wasn't really very funny, because we were a bit of a panic. But the next morning, I was involved in handing out the annual New Zealand Recreation Awards, where the industry acknowledged people for doing great things. And it was a breakfast. Not everyone turned up, because some people were still sort of a bit probably partied out from the Halloween party the night before. But I didn't even know who was getting the awards. But I noticed that there were these big bouquets of flowers that I had to hand out, one to Sharon Van Gulik, to acknowledge the work that she'd been doing within local government. That was back in the Hillary Commission days. And I just happened to sort of say, and for your breakfast, here is, and gave her this. And so the people who knew, because it was such a story, calling the poison center in the middle of the night. So that was a funny thing that I shared with the industry at an early age. And I still think about those days. Even Pete Dale, who was, in charge of, the Hillary Commission back then, he was eating carnations that night. So it was a funny thing. I think we've all grown up now, and we don't do that as much. We certainly don't eat purple flowers like irises. No. But yeah, that was a funny time.
That's good. I thought you were going to reference Datura somewhere in that story that you've just related there. Nasturtiums are fine, of course. We can still eat nasturtiums. Great story.
Yeah, that was fun.
Hey, before hearing more about what you've been up to since leaving New Zealand, I am keen to share with our audience one fact that I learned while preparing for our chat, and that was taken from a piece of research published at the 1984 Olympics, the LA Olympics, which you competed at, which found that synchronised swimmers, your sport, and I quote, are the most physically fit all-round athletes because of their gymnastic flexibility, stamina, aerobic capacity, and strength. Add that to the infinite list of things I never knew, Katie.
Wow. Well, there's a little story about that too. And that was always true. I guess the thing is that, when I sort of started off my career in the water, because I did water polo after synchro, and I sort of started off of doing the up and down the lanes swimming as well, it's a huge demand time-wise on young kids, because you have to have the strength and stamina of a competitive swimmer. You have to have the flexibility of a gymnast. So you do all the online and in the water, out of the water. I mean, when I was kind of 13 and 14, we were training 30 hours a week. It was really huge. But the story is, they are definitely. I remember that study because a lot of people, make a lot of fun of synchronized swimming. Well, that's their issue. I look at all sports as having their absolutely intrinsic benefits. But when I was competing at the Olympics in 1984, I have a really, really, really fast heart rate, and I always have. And regardless of when I was in my peak prime, it has always been fast resting pulse. And my sister and I, who was my duet partner in LA, Lynette, we went to, it's just one of those kind of, I don't know, it's one of stuff in a shop, jump on, get your heart rate, stuff like that, just a funny monitor thing. Yeah. And I did it. And I this was like 2 days before I was competing in the games. And it said, please do not exercise unless you have spent some time with your physician. It happened to be Dr. Dave Gerard at that time. So that I always think about that. But yes, no, that was a good study, and it's a very physically demanding sport. Yeah. But it formed a very much a part of my early career.
Oh, I've seen that and I've read that, and I'm going to zip you forward now to 2017. You leave New Zealand, you take up this role with World Rugby as the first ever general manager for women's rugby, as I understand it, based in Ireland. What attracted you to the role, and what were you asked to do?
Well, it was a really funny time in my life, I must admit, because at the time I was not working in sport. I had, when I left working, that kind of career from the Hillary Commission to Spark to New Zealand Sports Foundation and Sport and Recreation New Zealand, I kind of left and then started getting involved in the volunteer set aside. And then it was my time to come off the boards of High Performance Sport New Zealand, Sport New Zealand. And I went along to an awards. It was the government's Sport New Zealand Awards. And unbeknownst to me, I was being given a Lifetime Achievement Award from Sport and Recreation New Zealand. And so John Wells read the citation, and I was listening to this, completely surprised. And I was listening and thinking, oh my God, I was young. And it was a Lifetime Achievement Award for my contribution for sport. And I thought, I'm just not over this yet. It's, I've really enjoyed stepping out and doing some things in some other sectors, but I sat down and I was listening to his words, and it made me think, it's time to do something international. And within 2 weeks, I was contacted about this job at World Rugby. And I remember I spoke to Steve Chu at the time and said, what do you reckon? He said, don't go there. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to do this and put my name in the hat. And I kind of, I took that job specifically because I saw what was happening in the world at women's rugby, and I really believed in the direction that they were taking after the Rio Olympics. But I also just saw some of the things that really needed to happen for women and women's leadership. So I applied. Literally 2 weeks after that award, I applied for that job. It was a long interview process, but I was successful in being appointed to what was an incredibly challenging role for me personally. But, they brought me in as what I would say as a disruptor. And I was at a time in my life, in my career that, I bought into what they were trying to achieve. And we did some pretty big stuff in 5 years.
I'm going to take you to some of that pretty big stuff over the course of this conversation. I am interested, just quickly though, why did Steve say, don't take the role?
Well, that's another little funny story. Steve and Karen Smith, who in charge of New Zealand Olympic and Commonwealth Games Association, and obviously colleague, and Steve's wife, Michelle Wilson, and I were very, very close friends for a long period of time. And our husbands and partners were close friends. And we set up this group, I probably shouldn't say this, but it's so funny now, called WART, which stood for Women Against Rugby on Television. Fun. And it was only really just because, when you were really young and you're in your early 20s and you go to these parties and the guys would all take off to the living room and they'd be watching rugby and the rest would be in the kitchen and all that kind of stuff. It was really for fun. Of course, we did not like rugby. Absolutely did not like rugby. We loved rugby. But we started this up at WART and we always just had this bit of a barter between us in terms of rugby, and so he always threatened to, and he did tell some of the guys that he was my referee for this job, and I said, do not talk about WART, please. And he didn't. I'll give him credit for that. He did not. It was not till I decided to move on to the Commonwealth Games world that little story came out. And I don't know. I don't think there was much behind it. It was just that I really wasn't part of the rugby community for a long period of time in New Zealand. Whilst I absolutely sort of saw the huge benefit from community development and the profile and branding and the lift that it gave us from a profile globally. I was more associated with Olympic and Commonwealth Games sports in my career in terms of high performance. So more attuned, so when the change happened and you had sevens in the Olympics, the stuff crossed over. So it seemed much more natural. And obviously, I loved watching the development of women's rugby in particular over those 5 years. Yeah, well, I
believe you came up against sort of a myriad views of from the ruling status quo, if you like, of rugby when you arrived. Some were supportive, some incredibly so. I've read some stories about how the CE and chair really supported you in the role, I believe, and what you were trying to achieve, but some not so supportive. And I'm interested to hear you just maybe share a little bit more detail about how you approached working with the naysayers, working through them, around them, taking. I'm not sure what approach you took. The people who felt that women shouldn't play the game.
Oh, yeah. Now, there are still people who think women shouldn't play the game, but hopefully, I was kind of loosely associated with 3 World Cups, 2 I was in the role and, got to see the amazing World Cup that we just had here in England. But there are people that still feel that it's too physical a game for women. And, I ran, I linked to that. One of the initial campaigns I ran for women's rugby, when it was about lifting the profile and kind of challenging those sort of stereotypes, was called, the Unstoppables, and where I picked 15 women from around the world who had a story to say, which mostly aligned to yours, you're talking. Whether it was the young woman who featured in my video, who was from India, who was basically told that she would never get married if she had bruises all over her legs, and it just wasn't the kind of thing to do. But, I guess I embraced, I think every organization resembles your wider stakeholders. So you will always have people internally that are skeptic about it. But I kind of think that the majority of them did get on board. And how I did that is I worked very, very, very closely with the chief executive to ensure that we didn't create what I would call a women's rugby unit inside World Rugby at that time. There was me and a support person. And basically what we did is we enlisted everyone across the organization to take responsibility for the change.
Okay.
And so, he said he would work with me to make sure that the KPIs of the senior leaders across the divisions all bought into the strategy that we were trying to achieve.
Okay.
So it became part of their performance management. So they didn't really have a lot of choice.
Right.
But, as things started to change and evolve, I think one of I quite often tell the story about when I first arrived at World Rugby, and I think people thought I should just be focusing on field, getting more women playing, and we didn't do that. I basically said, if we do not attack with vim and vigor the leadership structure in terms of who is leading in the game and get more women involved in decision making, we will never change. It's just always going to be hard. And when I started, the council was 30 men.
Yeah.
That was it. There was not a single woman on the board.
Yeah.
But, I guess one of the big wins that happened in my first couple of years was when I worked with Sir Bill Beaumont and Brett to change that. And by the end of the first year, we had 17 women directors on that 30. So we did increase the size of the board, but we had almost a third were women. So that was fundamental in terms of changing people's perceptions and decision-making and how fast you could make the move that needed to happen.
I also understand, though, prior to that 17, there was kind of a conversation or an expectation that there would be one additional, one female member on that board. And I believe you confronted that fairly quickly.
I did. And it was Bill, and he was doing the right thing because he was absolutely a firm believer in the potential of growing the sport.
Yeah.
And that the major way to do that was by addressing the potential of women's rugby. But we were sitting in a room with the senior leadership team and him and, Gus Pichot. I mean, it was back in those days. And we were at that stage, what they were proposing, I had a kind of draft strategy across 5 pillars, and they were, under the leadership stuff, what they wanted to do was to set quotas for our members. So we would say each of the unions must have by such and such. And I completely understand at different sports and different organizations at different stages that quotas work. But basically what I said, we can't do that. Look at ourselves. I'm the only woman in this room. There's no woman on the executive board, and there are no women on our council. We can't. And he suggested, he said, well, I've got an idea. I think what we should do is create another vice president role, and we should have a woman's vice president. And I just said to him, I said, Bill, look, it's a step in the right direction, but that's just tokenism. That's not, we have to do something really symbolic that says that we mean a difference. And then literally that room started brainstorming about what some options were, and we came up with a loophole, and he drove that. So, full credit to him and what I call the ambassadors that supported me on that change is that by the end of that year, there were 17 women directors. And you couldn't be on any of the subcommittees or anything like that unless you were involved in the council. So now you've got, there are women in CEO roles, there are women presidents, the English Rugby Union is now she actually was one of my unstoppables. But all across the organization on a board and all the subcommittees and the unions, you see women.
What a cracking result. You and your team also developed a strategy or a campaign called Try and Stop Us. What was that trying to do? What was that aiming to do?
Well, that was aiming at completely fronting some of those stereotypes about why women shouldn't play. And so I worked with our unions to pick 15 women who had some incredible stories that they had overcome in terms of breaking those barriers. Yeah. And each of them, became a star in their countries and globally to actually have a force of people that sort of said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to come across. And they became ambassadors. And then we had a global Try and Stop Us 15 with, some amazing women and amazing stories. And then what happened at a regional level is that we challenged the regions to do the similar thing. So there was an unstoppable team from Asia, and those young women were at different stages, and they were, some were referees, some were just new to the game. There was a really young girl, fortunate from Uganda, who I think she was about 10 at the time, and I had seen her on a podcast that was being led by one of the woman who I had on scholarships. And this young girl was teaching, was coaching women's rugby. She was just a kid, and she was playing, she was refereeing, she was just doing the whole gambit. And I wrote to her just to say that I'd seen her on this podcast, and I sent her a bit of gear from World Rugby. And at the village, it became this episode of opening up these gifts and her water bottles and all that stuff. And then I got her involved in their campaign. And I was just watching her on some of her social media just the other day and just seeing how she had developed. But yeah, it was picking people who had significant challenges.
Can I ask you?
Yep.
I'd like to steer you into one country that I'm particularly interested in, having worked in the Middle East for 16 odd years now, and that's to talk just briefly about Iran. I mean, I suspect actually Iran isn't actually that well understood by most people in New Zealand, and part of that I think is failing, as I used to do back in the day before we started working in the Gulf, and we don't work in Iran. We're in other parts of the Gulf states. Failing to distinguish, I guess, between the regime that rules the country and, in my experience, the people who live under it. And I've seen some numbers relating to this campaign that you and your team rolled out, which said that at this point, they may be dated now, but they said at this point there were 3,000 Iranian women involved in rugby pre-campaign, and that catapulted up to 10,500 post-campaign. What was the magic in that country in particular?
There was a very special lady who featured in my campaign, Nahid, who's still very much involved in rugby. She was a leader within the union, and she was very involved in Asia rugby. So, when you would go along to some of the regional meetings, the regional administration meetings, and I asked her if she would be part of the campaign. But it was such a cultural challenge for me because I hadn't spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I couldn't have a session with her on her own without having males present. But they agreed to let her be part of that campaign. And we flew her to London and she told her story, and the challenges there, that at that stage, and things have probably moved on, but, they had to play behind closed doors. They had to be, one of the fast growth areas for them was that they needed to, in many of the areas where it was developing, they needed to be coached by women. So we had to fast track what was going on there. But she was really, really, really brave. And I remember, she was really nervous. So she came to London. She was there for 3 days with these other 15 women who all just grew from each other because they had such stories to tell. And she was kind of one of the last to leave. And she sort of said to me when she left, about how much she had grown from hearing other people's stories, but that she was a bit nervous going back because, it was a big thing to come out of the country and be part of that campaign. And she wasn't 100% sure how she would be received when she did get back. But she went from someone who was very closed to doing a lot of media. That she kind of sort of got involved in telling her story within Iran, and it just grew. I mean, it really, really grew. And so she's a special, and she's someone who's in touch with all those young women from that long period of time and the scholarship recipients. Every now and then they'll drop me an email and they'll tell me how they're getting on. She married a rugby player, has got a beautiful child, and is still very actively involved in pushing the game. And I quite often get videos of what's going on there. But I also think just linking to that, whether it's in Iran or we had a lovely young Muslim woman from Malaysia, and I think I used to really wonder why the sport was growing so much in some of those sports that had such strict religious connotations about what women could and couldn't do. And I kind of just thought that rugby of all sports was if you're going to get on the field and you're going to play women's rugby, you're made of core stuff. You really are. And it kind of gave you that opportunity to show your strength and to show that you really mean things. And so from that perspective, it was kind of a channel to just stand up. I think. And one strong catalyst. I'm going to come back to that thought a bit later. My last question before I move on to what you're doing now is there anything that you regret now that you weren't able to achieve while in the role? I know we've done a really light touch in terms of your time there, but anything no, I didn't get that over the line moments? It took a while to crack the council was a quick fix. The executive board took a lot longer to get so we sort of start off with an amazing independent women's director, Angela Ruggiero from the US, who has so much to offer. In my time, we really tried to get a second and a third woman on the executive, and that just didn't happen. But it happened very closely afterwards. So, I still think that the biggest thing when you're really trying to change, you can't just do it from one person. You can be a catalyst to start it, but you really need to have a strong and committed, wide group of women in leadership roles, whether that's coaching or, as role models for other coaches or administrators, to really start making that kind of change. So I think we moved faster than a lot of people ever thought we would. But there's still more to go in that space.
Yeah. And cementing it. I mean, that was the other thing I really took out of that story you just shared on the what I call the catalyst in Iran, and that she is still doing it, and she's still in contact with you, and she's still driving it, because there is a danger sometimes that when we take the kind of sales/marketing drivers off something and a catalyst is gone, removes itself, and I'm now talking about you, that things can dissipate. They can fall over with a change of direction. And it does sound like there's a wonderful legacy, which I wish we could spend more time on, but I want to now take you to the Commonwealth Games Federation and what you're doing now. But you made this change in 2021. You decide to apply, and you are successful in applying to become the CEO of the Commonwealth Games Federation. Now, you were born in Scotland, you were raised in Canada, and then you moved to New Zealand. So you are actually a poster child of the Commonwealth, aren't you?
I know, there's a bit more to that. My father's Australian. He's from Perth. My grandfather was from South Africa, and my great-great-grandfather is from Northern Ireland, but, a rugby nation, a Commonwealth nation in a way, but not the, obviously. So I do call myself the Commonwealth kid when you think about it. I do speak the language.
So you could almost argue this is in your DNA, but you were the first female to get the job, and I'm wondering why it took that long before a woman secured this role.
Well, to be fair, I mean, the organization is about to be 100 years old in 2030. So that's a major milestone coming up. But there hasn't been a lot of chief executives during that period of time. And a couple of them have been, Mike Cooper from New Zealand, he was there for a very long time. So he left after, leading the New Zealand Olympic and Commonwealth Games Association there. And then there was David Grenenberg, and then there was myself. So I don't think, so it's not like I'm the first of 20. I may be the first of 3. It was very much an amateur organization for a period of time.
Okay.
But it is very much a privilege to lead such a special organization at such an interesting period of time.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that too. Why did you want the role?
Well, like I said when I was talking about my rugby experience, I love Olympic and Commonwealth Games. And so, in New Zealand, I guess that was my legacy, was all the elite stuff. High performance sport. And I've been very fortunate. I think I've been to 8 Commonwealth Games in a variety of capacities and 3 or 4 Olympics. So I love the buzz of being in that multi-sport environment. And it was very much part of my career, sort of seeing people across all sorts of different sports achieve their biggest dreams, and seeing what that does to inspire nations to actually participate. So to have the opportunity to get back, whilst I loved the opportunity to do what I was doing in World Rugby, but to go back into something that was probably a lot more familiar to me, albeit in a different capacity, at a time when the organization had some major challenges facing it. And I kind of think that's what I really enjoyed doing, is being sort of faced with something it's in a good space, but not a great space. And there is people that want to change. And so it just seemed like a no-brainer at a time when kind of I was thinking that probably maybe I would have done another year at World Rugby, and then I would have been looking at coming home. But this job came up, and I just said, no, let's give this a go. Okay.
We're going to get into one of the more obvious challenges that even I'm aware of in terms of the Games. What were the big ones that you felt confronted the Games when you walked in that door?
Well, when I walked into that door, there was a Games taking place in Birmingham and no other. There was no 26. So,
this was Birmingham
forward, and I'm sure you'll tell. So
Birmingham 2022.
So I arrived in November, end of October and November, and we had no games for 2026.
Why is that?
Yeah.
Why did we have no games for 2026?
Well, we had a sort of situation, I guess this was pre-me, where the Games was awarded to Durban, and it got pulled for a variety of different reasons. And so then what happened was the UK, I believe, was looking at hosting the games in 26. And at that stage, it hadn't been decided who was going to host it. And basically the UK were asked and had put up their hand to say, we will come forward and we will do the 2022 games, which meant there was no games for 26.
Right.
So that was the stark reality of, at that stage, the last strategic plan was just coming to an end. So that there needed to be a real think about where we were taking the movement. But there was, the biggest thing facing me at that point in time was that there was no games in 26. And so pretty big challenge when that's what that core thing that you do is deliver that games every 4 years. So that's what I arrived into. Was how did we turn this around as quickly as possible? And fortunately we did. But I'm sure we're going to talk about what happened next. But we did work with what happened out of the blue was the state of Victoria in Australia. Saw the potential and some of the things that we were doing with the games reset, and approached us at that time to say, hey, we'd quite like to throw our name in the hat for 26. And under a really short period of time, that was turned around where within, 6 months we had the games in Victoria ready for 2026.
Can I hold you there? Because I think there's a little gap, at least in my understanding of what happened between Birmingham in 2022 and Victoria putting its hand up. I believe that there was a strategy written. You said that there was no...
strategic plan.
A strategic plan called Commonwealth United. And that there was a Commonwealth Unite, was it? Tell me about the vision that was contained in that plan.
Yeah. So that was the... So once Victoria was sort of settled, and I was put onto the board of Victoria, as was Dame Louise Martin, who was the past president, and I quickly set about working to create a new strategy for the Commonwealth. And we did a significant, it was a 12-month process of consulting our members, stakeholders, hosts who'd had games before, athletes, about what was it about the Commonwealth that made it a special organization that these 74 members wanted to be part of. And so we basically had a vision which was about uniting the Commonwealth through sport. We talked about how sport was one of the biggest manifestations of that major club, the Commonwealth Club, and that there was all sorts of potential beyond sport to use that mechanism to drive all sorts of different initiatives to unite the Commonwealth and deal with diversity and equity, and really, use sport to help many of our members connect on so many levels beyond sport. So a big strategy which talked to doing some things differently, to revisiting what the games of the future was, to sort of say, look, we're 100 years young. It's time to think about where do we want to be in 100 years. In the next 100 years, that's a 10-year strategy, but to really call out some of the things that we were doing in terms of athletes and advocacy, some of the things that we were doing in terms of, some of our programs, particularly aimed at addressing inequitable situations with Paralympic athletes and women as a leadership, and across that kind of rambit of things that are really core from a sport development perspective. So a robust strategy that got signed off and launched literally 3 weeks before Victoria pulled out of the Commonwealth Games.
So let's go there. 1 second though. Okay. I also understand that something that came out of that strategy, which I particularly picked up on, was that there was a focus on sustainability, a focus on cost containment, a focus on access and legacy, rather than maybe, my language probably not yours, an obsession on just another bigger games to follow, right? Okay.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Victoria delivers, I'm going to call it a bombshell, and says, we're not interested. We're not doing it. Yeah?
Yeah.
What?
Do you want to hear about that?
I do want to hear about that. I'm quite interested to hear how you responded on hearing the news.
Okay. Well, it's, at some stage in my life, I always say, I'm just putting together all these things for chapters in my book. And this is going to be, it's a chapter that sometimes, you pinch yourself and you say, did that really happen? But it kind of went like this. I mean, I'd just come back. As I said, I was on the board of the Victoria Commonwealth Games Association. And we're not saying there weren't challenges with some of the direction that the state wanted to take the games. In terms of that regional games and the costs associated with that. But what happened was I was given a phone call from the Australian High Commission about 2 weeks before this announcement saying that there were a couple of people that were coming from the government, that they would be working in the Australian High Commission for a period of time and that they wanted to meet. Could I meet them in our offices? And I sort of thought, oh, sure, thinking there was something that I thought was about to happen politically in the state of Victoria. And I thought, oh, maybe they want to brief me about that. So we agreed to have a meeting, and Dame Louise Martin, who is the president, came down to our offices in London. She's based in Scotland. And we greeted these two gentlemen for what we thought was a meet and greet. They kind of walked around the office. We gave them a cup of tea. And then we sort of sat down and they both opened up their computer and read a script.
Oh, no.
And proceeded to tell me that in 7 hours' time, that Dan Andrews was going to announce to the state of Australia that Victoria was pulling out of hosting the Commonwealth Games. I just looked at him. I said, pardon? In 7 hours' time. I said, and there was a lot more to that. There was a kind of an interesting, as I was listening to him, and I just sort of said to them, I said, listen, first of all, there is no provision for you to pull out of hosting the Commonwealth Games. Mm-hmm. I suggest you leave now and come back and see me in an hour when I have my lawyers here and we sit down and work through what it is that you're actually trying to communicate. So I sent them away and I quickly pulled together our legal team and the comms team. It was kind of it was bizarre. I mean, it was so unexpected. That next 24 hours, so they had come to do a deal. So they, said, oh, they appreciated that this would be quite shocking and
do you think?
That we might not be expecting it. So they were prepared to put some money on the table, which was just a joke. It was just a joke. So they had been given the authority to make a deal. And I sort of said, there's no deal. There's no deal going on. So so then basically I went through 24 hours and I think my first step was, make sure the family knows what's going on. So we worked right through that night with our team and because they wouldn't even at that stage, they wouldn't give me a press release. They wouldn't even say what they're saying and all that kind of sort of stuff. So we wrote them a pretty stern letter reminding them that they couldn't do what they were saying to do. Mm-hmm. And I had an emergency board meeting and I needed to make sure that the members knew what was going on. So when they woke up in the morning, so that they knew where we were at and what I was doing about it. And even to the extent, and bless him, Craig Phillips, who's the chief executive of the Australian Commonwealth Games Association, I had to call him, so he was on the board as well. He was based in Sydney and in Melbourne. And I phoned him and I kept trying to ring him. Of course, it was 3 or 2 o'clock in the morning and I just kept ringing and I kept ringing. And he picked up the phone eventually and he said, what is it? I said, Craig, I'm sorry to do this to you, but in 3 hours' time, your country is going to be told, so it was, so the first 24 hours was dealing with the family, making sure that they knew what was going on. Yeah. And then we moved very quickly after the board meeting, and we got our legal understanding into what I call managing a very messy divorce. Yep. That was my next phase, where in the end, I guess I headed a team delegated by the board to negotiate what our exit strategy would be in a mediation process, which was actually down in Australia. I think it was at the final of the Women's World Cup in Sydney, where I joined a meeting of, I think it was 18 men, to work through, with my marching orders from the board about what could be accepted and not accepted. So we negotiated an exit. I think, this is all in the public domain of 380 million Australian dollars. Yeah. And then the next phase at the same time was to undertake what I call a speed dating exercise for the next 6 months about what were we going to do about 2026. Yeah. And whilst we were doing that, because there was a lot of really very, very well-meaning countries and mayors, several in New Zealand, that put up their hand and say, pick us, we want to do this. Because, there's a fondness for the Commonwealth Games. Sure. But sometimes that's a political statement and they don't really necessarily understand the extent of the games. And we were still doing that reset model. So to managing that and a process where we decided to allocate a significant proportion of that settlement into, because there was no time, into providing that grant to a host to enable them to actually to run a reset games. So that was the next part, the speed dating exercise. But at the same time, because one of the things we said we would do in the strategic plan was look at other products that we might want to develop for the Commonwealth, which was going to be a piece of work we did whilst we were running a Commonwealth Games in Victoria and a tender process to 2030, but we had to bring that forward, and we did some really good thinking there. So speed dating exercise, which was full of all sorts of stories, but then, come early the following year, Glasgow put their hand up. We did have a few countries that we were working through, but Glasgow, in the end, put up their hand to work with us to deliver, what we call a reimagined games for next year. Which is going to be really, really exciting. It's really, really exciting. So it was a safe pair of hands because, we were working with people like Ian Reid, who's the president of Commonwealth Games in Scotland, and he was the CEO of Birmingham, which was such an outstanding games. And they have been there, done that several times, Scotland, in terms of delivering.
I was going to say, there's a kind of lean into a core competency, capability, and an infrastructure asset, and obviously a beautiful city as well in Glasgow, which is just gorgeous. And close to you, I guess there's a proximity thing too in terms of your speed dating and the pace at which you can move, and I guess some really pragmatic considerations around time zones as well, and thinking how, you need to kind of like have everything in your favour at this point when you're scrambling to put on something of this magnitude and order and professionalism and all of the things I know that the Commonwealth Games will be in July, isn't it? Do you think that Victoria's withdrawal is going to give you a few chapters at least in your book, so that's a good thing, but do you think it could also have potentially been something of a tonic for the Commonwealth Games movement? I'm going to say, you don't have to agree with this, but it was sort of like plucking a triumph from a disaster moment.
Well, what do they say? You never let a storm not get in the way of it made us think sharply fast. It made us think about the things that we said that we would do over the 10-year period and bring them forward at speed. And it certainly, it gave us some money to be able to make some of those calls. I mean, we're not the IOC. So all of a sudden, we could take some risks under that short term, whilst at the same time realize that we needed a real rethink about the Commonwealth Games. We're not a mini Olympic Games. We are quite a different product, and we are absolutely committed and really exciting. Next week, I'm going into the General Assembly where the membership will come together, and hopefully they will endorse the recommendation that's made from our board that Ahmedabad be the host of the Centenary Games in 2030. But at the same time, as soon as 26 was sorted, that we went into this, what are we doing for the Centenary Games? And we spent a lot of time doing a reset of the Games, bringing it as something that is much more achievable for many hosts around the Commonwealth, to cut out some of the things that had been traditional costs that probably grew in from, back in the last Melbourne Commonwealth Games, which I was kind of involved on the outside in a different capacity, was that so it drove what we have just gone through was an expression of interest process where we had 5 of our members as a result of the reset put up their hand and say, hey, we're interested in 2030, and another 2 say we're interested in 2034. So 7 members, which was unprecedented, but because of the reset, because of how we saw the games of the future. So that's really exciting.
That is exciting, and I'm interested if you could paint a picture for any athletes. I was going to say Kiwi athletes and Kiwi tourists, sports tourists who are planning on going to the Games. What can they expect to see in 2026 as a result?
Yes, as a result. Well, 2026, I mean, is going to be a special Games. I mean, we talk about Glasgow as being the bridge to the future Games. So the reset, so what they've done in their hands-up mentality is they've said, we will deliver a games, albeit a smaller number of sports, for this games only. So there's 10 sports, but they're using existing facilities. So we're not spending money on building facilities in a very compact environment. So athletes, can walk between the facilities and where the accommodation is.
Nice.
So you're not in this kind of huge, how am I going to get from there to there? So it's kind of, it's an action packed within an 8-mile radius. All the facilities are there. With a huge commitment on that athlete experience, but not spending money on building villages, but creating shared spaces amongst that kind of hub that will be quite special. But what it's giving us the opportunity to do is to test some of the things that we think are important to take on board as future games. So whilst, for example, if I talk about maybe security, when you think about the Birmingham Games and the budget that was associated with hosting games before, we've kind of looked at that and sort of said, well, why, when you run a World Championships, do you need this level of security? And when you run a Commonwealth Games, you add another £100 million onto it. So let's just start looking at some of those sensible decisions that are made and say, what is really needed to actually to run an international games, and where are the areas that you can trim without at all impacting on athlete experience / spectator experience, which have just grown and grown and grown, and then replicate things like the IOC and the Olympic movement that isn't necessarily, we don't believe, are needed. Nice. So there's a lot of innovation, and there's a lot of, the chief executive of the Games in Glasgow was involved in, all the opening ceremonies and all the events and all the cultural aspects. And he's a guy called Phil Batty, incredibly creative, and definitely looking at innovating on everything we do within a significantly reduced budget, but to drive something that will have memories for people forever. And that leads into the next games. So the next games will not be, it won't be 10, it'll be more sports, and we'll be talking about that at a General Assembly, and India will be talking about their vision. And that will be special as well, because we will have 100 years to celebrate. So there'll be things that happen in the whole lead up into that games.
Very, very cool. I actually can't wait for Glasgow. I know you're saying it's smaller. I think that the innovation, the creativity that goes with having your resource base kind of slashed and the surprise sprung on you and everything else that comes forth. I mean, I also suspect like a smaller games is actually a sign of the Commonwealth Games Federation not being tone deaf to a lot of the world at the moment as well. We're getting just bigger for the sake of getting bigger. Maybe actually doesn't fly now, isn't actually as respected potentially as it once was. I'm going to now turn this conversation a little bit more onto you in New Zealand, actually, just for the time that we've got remaining here. Throughout your career, you've built a reputation, an incredibly strong reputation. You've got those things, strategic smarts and, competency, hugely competent. You build deeply loyal teams. And I know this because I know a lot of them, and I've, obviously worked in the same organisation as you, and you're known for executing and you're known for delivering. Now, a number of people that I spoke to in the lead up to this conversation said that if asked to pick one of your exceptional talents, it is connecting to people from all walks of life, no matter the background, no matter the culture, no matter the gender, the age, or the status. I'd love to know how accurate you think that assessment of you is.
Yeah. Well, I absolutely believe in diversification of thought. And I also believe, when I started out as a manager, and I was really young, and I was, it's funny, Paul, I almost brought the fish stuff to my funny story with you involved in it back in Toro. But when I think of what I learned about managing, when I started off, I used to think that you would kind of try and look at everyone and you'd understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, and you just focus on fixing their weaknesses. And then I kind of and then you would have all these people that was kind of all capable of doing everything. And then I got a real eye opener that wasn't the way to build teams, and that you needed to really actually understand that you needed to play to people's strengths rather than try and fix their weaknesses. And that if you played to people's strengths and you got teams to understand that everyone brings something different, and you might look at that person and sort of say, well, why doesn't that person have to do that when I have to do that? But once you kind of get into that mindset that people, when you embrace the fact that people bring different things to the whole, and that you all benefit from that, then you as a whole become so much more powerful. And that is looking at diversity. And so I've always been someone who's just, when I think of my friends and the people that I work with, they're a kind of like they are a group of diverse people from different backgrounds and different experiences, but they do kind of connect.
Yeah.
Now, would they all be together if I wasn't in the room? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either.
It is. Yeah, but I do love connecting people and getting people to actually understand that, that kind of wider diversity is really, it's just flavorful in terms of what the world should be.
I think that description of you is dead accurate in terms of the people that I've spoken to. And you've confirmed that in my mind in your answer. I also see Kiwis the planet over described to one level of or another. Like this, all right? Our ability to relate, you are interested in people. You're a people person, I think is the cliche. Do you think that could be a shared character trait for Kiwis? Perhaps this is one of the reasons we're so employable. Perhaps this is one of the reasons our diaspora is so large, 1 million of us now living overseas, like yourself, making lives for themselves, making, obviously, driving forth, going forth. Could this be one of the reasons we're so sought after in international markets and countries around the world?
Yeah, I think we are really good at connecting. When I talk to young people about leadership and things that I think is really important, I say, look, you got to start really early with that little black book and write down who you've met and what you've learned from them and stay in touch with them, because you never know when you're going to come together again, and that you need to have your own stakeholder plan. But, particularly in London, I found London, the Kia group here has been absolutely amazing at just connecting and inviting you to things, and you meet New Zealanders from all sorts of different worlds, and you connect with them. But I do think that, I don't know, maybe it's, we're 5.3 million people down there. We come to the other side of the world. We're curious. We want to learn from others, but we also want to share. So connecting and that whole kind of stakeholder networking, to me, is just critical to anyone who's moving overseas.
Look, I agree. And I guess the word I've got for it is network effect, that connection of people and forging of relationships. There's a military expression of being a force multiplier, and whether it's applicable here or not, I think it is. But, I think it's one of the ways that our expat population is lifting New Zealand's profile in incredibly positive ways. And I'm going to use you as an example again. Just looking at what we've discussed briefly over the last, nearly 50 plus minutes. There are now rugby players and administrators in countries from Laos to Iran who definitely know the role you played in bringing a game and social growth to their lives. You've confirmed that. They've stayed in contact with you since you left the role, and they're still involved. They're still doing it. There's now a membership organisation the size of the Commonwealth. I think there's something like, am I right on this, 2.5 billion people within the Commonwealth? Is that about there or thereabouts?
Yep.
Yeah. And as I understand it, more than 60% of them under the age of 30 who are looking at you and your team, because I know you're going to acknowledge a team if I just point the finger at you, helping transform the Commonwealth Games, which only a few scant years ago, Katie, people were saying to me were an anachronism. They were saying that the Games were actually on the way out, that there wasn't a place in the calendar for the Commonwealth Games. So how do you think what you're doing and how you're doing it is shaping the world's view of Aotearoa New Zealand?
Well, I think that New Zealanders take on big tasks. They don't shy away from them. They lean in. And when things get thrown at you, you don't necessarily do it on your own, or you go back down to that stakeholders. You reach out to others that have been there in that space to actually get wise advice about how you actually map the way forward. But they know that you're doing it for the right reason, and that you're connecting people and bringing people along with you on a vision. And I'm really fortunate to work with, at a board level, and at a senior staff and organization level with people who are absolutely passionate and committed to what the Commonwealth connections, Commonwealth sport, and the Commonwealth Games does. So from that perspective, like I said, next week is a really big one for us. We've got all the Commonwealth coming together. We've got a delegation from India, our biggest member, 1.6 billion. We have Nigeria in a great space, who we will work with in terms of future games, all really excited about the potential of sport across the Commonwealth.
Yeah, well, it's a week to look forward to. I'm nearly down to my last question because I'm realising I'm digging into your time, your morning. With your global sport and leadership perspective, what opportunities, if any, do you see for New Zealand and New Zealanders on the world stage?
Oh, there's so many. Give
me three. Give me your top three.
In terms of roles or leadership.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the things that working in an organization does like this is it shows you where good practice exists, and being able to connect good practice and fast track people in some of these countries in terms of their own sport work themselves. There's so many opportunities. People are thirsty for knowledge out there. New Zealand does absolutely great things that can be shared across many of the members of the Commonwealth in terms of sport and sports leadership. So from that perspective, I think it's amazing. I think, I guess the work that we're doing on events and event execution, New Zealand runs major events, having that export people, being part of events that are taking part. We run Commonwealth Championships, we run Commonwealth Games, we run Commonwealth Youth Games. We've got kind of a whole pipeline of those. There's all sorts of opportunities there. To me, getting the living in New Zealand, you are absolutely committed to actually understanding where good practice is around the world, and you fast track, not to emulate everything that happens over there, but certainly to actually understand why you do what you do with the resources that you have. And that means that you think incredibly strategic and smart about what you do. So that kind of consulting group, and I know a lot of people that are sort of in international consulting companies that we tap into from time to time that are Kiwis. So right across the whole kind of gambit of sport, from development to elite sport. Nice
answer. When you get to the end of this role, if you could wave some fairy dust, create something in New Zealand that would attract you back to our shores, what would that opportunity ideally look like? Just quickly.
Wow. Well, first of all, I love New Zealand. I have a house in Tihoro on the beach, and I look at it. It's rented out right now, and I look at it and I think, when am I going to be back there? When am I back there? So it's definitely part of my plan. I think probably what I would like to do is to share what I've learned. Whether that's assisting with some of the boards down there, but also just connecting people with great ideas from around the world. So that that kind of consulting, advising, but probably also just taking. I just love New Zealand from the chill perspective. I'd be quite happy to come back and relax and be called upon if my ideas are thought to be of useless. You never know. New Zealand is one of the countries that's put in an expression for Commonwealth Games in the future. So let's see where that goes. It's not 2030, but it is beyond. So we'll see where it happens there.
Nice work, Katie. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you, and I, for one, am really looking forward to the Games in Glasgow. Good luck for next week as well with your big week. And just go well. I think you've given us so many things to think about, and so many things I think for the audience that listen to this podcast to engage with as well, and appreciate what you're doing on the global sporting stage, or the global stage full stop. So thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Lovely to talk.
And a huge thank you to our audience for joining us. Please subscribe, leave a review, and join me in a fortnight for our next episode of Kiwi Fleas. I'm Paul Sinclair. I've been lucky enough to talk to Katie Sadleir, and it's time for us to flee.